has left the cupboard bare.
We've put in significant support to low and middle income people, lifted benefits multiple times, family tax credit, childcare allowance.
If we didn't deliver tax reduction, yes, I would resign.
And so what will it do to house prices?
Well, I don't know what it will do to house prices.
The National Party's housing policy is in nearly bigger shambles as their foreign buyer tax is.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage the moderators for tonight's debate, National Affairs Editor Andrea Vance and Stuff Political Editor Luke Malpass.
Tēnā koutou koutou, good evening and a very warm welcome to the post-finance debate. I bet you're all glad that music stopped now. Luke and I are absolutely thrilled to be here tonight. We're not going to waste any time. We want to get right into this. So please allow me to welcome to the stage from the National Party, Nicola Willis. And from the Labour Party, Grant Robertson.
Now, Grant Robertson, Nicola Willis, it is a privilege to have you both here tonight. Both of you are Wellington people. You've spent most of your working lives here, and you are two of the most recognised Wellingtonians, if not people, in the country at the moment. So it's terrific you can do this in your hometown, and a huge thank you to you both for your time tonight. Now, this is about the 7th time, I believe, you've faced off in a debate in this campaign. So you know each other well, possibly too well, I bet it feels at times. But you've been doing this up and down the country, and we would assume and hope that you're both experts by now.
So what we hope to get out of this evening is an open and frank discussion of the economic issues that are facing the country right now. One of you is going to be holding the purse strings, or perhaps a joint checking account with Winston Peters. So let's hear what you have to say. We've divided this debate into 4 different themes. So we're going to get underway with the first theme of the evening, the key theme of this election campaign, the cost of living.
So let's start with some basics. Nicola Willis, since the start of the pandemic in 2020, fuel prices have risen by 2/3. How much is it to fill up a 60-litre tank of petrol today?
It's about $2.90.
Grant Robertson?
Just a bit over that, actually. It's at about $3 is the average at the moment, I believe.
About $180 for a tank of gas today at the BP across the road.
Grant, if you went to the supermarket today and bought a block of butter, 2 litres of milk and a kilo of mince, roughly how much would you be spending?
The kilo of mince would be about $18 or $19 probably. The milk would be around $4 and the butter would be around $5.
So the total?
8 and 5 is 23, 27, $28.
Nicola?
Yeah, it is about 27 or 28.
So this was a bit contentious backstage. So it's about $25 if you go to the Countdown, and about $32 if you shop at New World.
So right in the middle there.
It depends, and I'd recommend that you went for the home brand, not the Anchor.
She's right.
Speaking of home brand, MPs are set to get a pay rise in December. Do you think in the middle of a cost of living crunch that's appropriate? Nicola Willis,
I think it should be independently assessed by the Remuneration Commission.
Which it is, and that's exactly how it should be. Our MPs have had a pay freeze for the last few years, but it is important that someone independent makes that decision, not politicians.
But do you deserve it?
I think politicians work extremely hard, but I recognise that everyone in New Zealand does as well. The good news is that wages are rising faster than inflation, Andrea, for everyone at the moment, 6.9% ahead of that 6% rate. Forecast to grow 4.8% over the next 4 years. So that's good for all New Zealanders.
Nicola? Do you think you deserve a pay rise?
Not only have wages risen slower than inflation throughout your term of government.
That's not true.
In the last year, and prices rose so much quicker than wages that you had to intervene to adjust benefits and super.
That's
because the facts are that actually people's earnings are not keeping up with
Well, actually, the facts are that they are. We had 1 year where they didn't, but 6.9% is larger than 6%, Nicola. It's a reasonably easy equation, I think.
In the year to December, Grant, in the year to December, the net average wage went up 6.24% and CPI went up 7.2%.
Just to keep up with the latest statistics, 6.9 over 6.
So this is what he does. He doesn't want to talk about
Tell the
his
truth.
record.
That's right. Bad luck.
He doesn't want to talk about his record because his record has delivered New Zealand a cost of living crisis.
Okay, Nicola. Interest rates have risen from their lowest point in history, during which time savings have gone backwards. Those interest rates have now normalised. So why do you think that they're too high?
Because for homeowners with a mortgage, it is almost impossible to make the adjustment to service a mortgage that once cost 2.9% in interest and now costs as much as 6.9% in interest, or 7.9%, depending on which bank. For people who've bought a home in the past few years, not only have they watched their equity disappear, but they are now having to find hundreds of extra dollars every fortnight to service their mortgage. And I've spoken to those people, and they are having to sacrifice like never before. Their kids aren't getting the food that they want them to get. They're having to cancel swimming lessons. We need to have downward pressure on interest rates, and that means getting inflation under control.
Grant, why do you think they're too high?
I couldn't hear it.
Why do you think they're too high?
Why?
Yeah.
Well, interest rates globally are high, Andrea, and if New Zealand was the only country in the world where inflation had gone up, or the only country in the world where interest rates had spiked, then there might be something in the argument that Nicola's making. Interest rates have stabilised and they're coming down. Inflation will come down into the Reserve Bank's 1 to 3% band next year. It's been really hard for New Zealand households and families as we've come out of COVID. We've seen this global cost of living crunch, but we've been there to support New Zealanders through that. And we put a budget together that puts downward pressure on inflation. The thing that will put upward pressure on inflation is introducing $5 billion a year of offshore money into our housing market, which is what's propping up Nicola's tax cuts.
I just want to do a little fact check. Can I do a little fact check? Because you've got away during this campaign saying that our inflation is just a global thing. Well, actually, our inflation rate's 6%. Australia, 5.2%. Canada,
Australia.
4%. US, 3.7%.
We'll fact check that number,
Eurozone,
again.
4.3%. What you did in 2022, when our inflation was peaking at 7.3%, was you went on the biggest spending
Do you know what I
budget
did, Nicola?
in New Zealand
I funded
history.
health properly. That's what I did.
The jobs tax, all of that
I
was more
funded health
important
properly,
to you
Nicola. That's
than
what I did in
restraining
Budget
spending.
2022.
Actually,
we put for the first time 2 years' worth of health funding in so people could actually plan. And I'd spent virtually the whole time I've been Minister of Finance making up for the fact that the National Party underfunded health year on year on year. We had a little thing called the pandemic in the middle, and then we came back to it with that funding in Budget 22. I stand by funding health.
And we'll get into health. We'll get into
In
health.
2022, Grant, if it's all about the pandemic.
Grant Robertson, I mean, the Reserve Bank is independent, but obviously you, the Minister of Finance and the Reserve Bank Governor need to make sure they're not working at cross purposes. I mean, how strong is your working relationship with Adrian Orr, and how would you assess his performance?
Well, I think our working relationship's been good. I think particularly in the early stages of the pandemic, we were meeting sometimes, once every couple of days, making sure we understood what monetary and fiscal policy we're both doing in terms of our response. I would say that Adrian's performance has been good. He's managed New Zealand through, as I had to do as Minister of Finance, an unprecedented set of circumstances. You've got to take yourself back to March 2020. We were getting messages that the bond markets might fall over. If you're the Reserve Bank Governor in that situation, you need to act, and you need to act strongly and decisively, and I believe Adrian did that.
And just turning on that issue to you, Nicola Willis, I mean, you said you'll initiate an independent inquiry into monetary policy decision-making over the past 3 years if you become Finance Minister. I mean, do you have confidence in Adrian Orr, and might his job depend on the findings of that review?
I would not have reappointed him without doing an external assessment of his performance. And actually, I'm joined by other political parties who agreed that there should be an external assessment of New Zealand's economic performance during COVID. So this isn't just a national thing. But Grant Robertson refused to do that. And I think that's a little bit cosy. Because what happened was we printed more money relative to the size of our economy than just about any other country in the world. We were 5th on the medal table. And at the same time, Grant was borrowing and spending at an enormous rate, the 2nd fastest in the world. Now, that combination is why our inflation is stickier today, and we should look at the decision-making that went on during that period.
Do you think maybe, Nicola, that the thing that spending did was save about 20,000 lives and thousands of businesses and hundreds of thousands of jobs? Because that's actually what happened. And we are reviewing COVID, and we have a Royal Commission that is looking at that, and it is looking into the financial decisions, including mine and those of the Reserve Bank. So that is already happening.
I'll join the New Zealanders who agree that spending to get through COVID was important. But what I won't agree with is that we should then be spending $30 billion more this year than during the COVID years.
Do you want to pay teachers? Do you want to pay nurses? Because that's what the money gets spent on.
As it was in 2021. That in 2022, a non-COVID year, you decided to embark on Te Pūkenga reforms, creation of the jobs tax, a light rail business case. You put the money hose out because COVID had provided you an excuse to do so.
79% of the new spending at the last budget was on cost pressures. That's the money that keeps our hospitals going, the money that keeps our schools going. And yes, we actually do want there to be good quality vocational education instead of the massive debt of Polytechs that I inherited when I came in. I stand by what we did, Nicola. Hindsight economics might be the future profession you want to take up, but it's not how you govern in today.
Okay, all right. Let's move on to the next question. This is to both of you, but we'll go Grant first.
I was going to say, what was the question?
Yeah, I know. I'm a bit lost myself. So, to get inflation down, unemployment is going to have to rise. So, is structural unfairness built into the system? And are the set of tools that the central bank has to play with, are they too narrow?
Well, the Reserve Bank does have, the single tool essentially of the official cash rate. My job, I believe, as the Minister of Finance is to make sure that we keep as many New Zealanders in work as we possibly can. And so there is a balance to be struck within the two different roles that we've got. Unemployment has now been below 4% for 24 months. That's a record. It's only been matched one other time when Michael Cullen was the Finance Minister. So I put up our record of defending New Zealanders' rights within the current environment that we have. That is also one of the reasons we gave the Reserve Bank a dual mandate. So it considers both inflation and maximum sustainable employment as a proxy for the quality of the whole economy. So it's a balancing act for all of us in here. But as Minister of Finance, I will always prioritise keeping people in work.
Okay, Nicola, do you want to respond? Is there structural unfairness, and is the set of tools that the Reserve Bank has to play with too narrow?
Well, look, I agree with Grant that the Minister of Finance should always work to achieve as little unemployment as possible. But it is wrong to then confuse the Reserve Bank's mandate by asking them to both chew gum and walk by having to do the employment thing as well as doing the inflation thing. That is not what's worked in New Zealand's history, and it shouldn't be what's happening now. But the second thing is this. The government has to do its bit to help out the Reserve Bank so that we don't have to lean so hard on interest rate rises. That means discipline to its own spending, ensuring that the regulatory environment is reducing cost, not adding cost to business, unblocking bottlenecks in the economy, such as the shortage of workers that you let carry on for far too long. Government has a role to play, and if it's left to the Reserve Bank, you get what we've got. Extremely high interest rates, higher than the other countries in the world we like to compare ourselves with.
Very quickly, Grant, do you want to respond before we move on?
Well, no, I do, as I say, I stand by what we did. It was important, and we've carried on our investment in keeping people in work. It's the person on the stage who wants to put thousands of people out of work before Christmas is Nicola Willis, not me.
Shame.
Okay, all right. So that concludes our first section. Whew. Let's move into our next section. We're going to talk about tax. To both of you, let's start with Nicola Willis. Who in New Zealand pays too much tax?
Working people. New Zealanders who get up each day and go to work and they earn modest to median incomes are paying far too much tax. And that's because Grant Robertson has willfully allowed inflation to push those workers into higher tax brackets so that they are paying higher average rates of tax. And when they get a pay rise, it gets eaten up by the extra tax they are having to pay. And that's why National is going to do the right thing and make adjustments for inflation and ensure that working people can keep more of their own money.
Grant Robertson.
Look, our position remains that we need to leave the tax rates where they are now. Now is absolutely the wrong time to be looking at tax cuts. It's never the right time with Labor. I let you talk, Nicola. Let me talk. Now is absolutely the wrong time to be cutting taxes, because this is a time where there is huge pressure on our public services. Of course, it would be great to go into an election and say, yep, we're going to offer tax cuts to all sorts of people. That's exactly what National's done in this election, and their tax plan does not add up. There are economists in the room tonight who've studied it and said it doesn't add up. You've got Goldman Sachs saying that it's going to add to inflation. So yeah, by all means, go out and offer tax cuts, but put on the table how you've worked out how you're going to pay for them. And in your plan, Nicola, it requires $20 billion of New Zealand property and land to be sold off over the next 4 years. It requires more children to go into poverty. It requires getting all of the money for climate action and removing it. So if that's the price of tax cuts right now, it is not a price worth paying.
What we have at the moment is a government with a spending problem. You are taking in, on average, $20,000 more in tax per household in New Zealand. And you have increased the levels of taxation and the levels of spending beyond what you said was plausible back in your 2017 fiscal plan, when you said spending should remain below 30% of GDP. And for the forecasts out into the future, your plan is to keep taxing New Zealanders more by allowing inflation to push them into higher tax brackets. Well, we are standing up and saying that's not okay. We've put out a fully costed plan that has been independently checked and verified, that depends on 8 different sources of reprioritisation
about 6 of
and
which
revenue.
Don't add up,
and
Nicola.
you know what? If we want to talk about plans that don't add up, I've been doing a little bit of work on yours. And if we actually look at the ridiculous promises you have made, you will never hit surplus, and debt will blow out even further than it is today. So don't stand there and give me a lecture on fiscal rectitude when you have never kept a single spending promise you've ever made.
I'd like to briefly jump in on one particular disagreement between the two of you, one of many evidently, in tax on this election, and that is what the National Party has dubbed the landlord tax. And the National Party said that they will reinstate being able to deduct interest off mortgages for rental properties. Now, Nicola, why is this fair?
Because what those additional taxes have done to renters is they have put more pressure on rents. And we have seen, since Labor changed the Bright Line test and removed interest deductibility, that rents on average have gone up another $80 a week. So first of all, this is about renters. But second, this is about principal tax treatment, in which you actually tax profit, not revenue. And this is a ridiculous move that Labor took because they were so embarrassed about the Kiwi Build failure and their complete failure on the housing crisis that they were looking for people to blame, and they chose to blame landlords. It's the politics of division. It's not good policy, and we're going to fix it.
So,
Grant Robertson, why?
Three things in response to that, Luke. The first is that Treasury, the Reserve Bank and the MHUD have looked at what influences rents, and it is supply of housing that is fundamentally the main influence on that, which is why we need to build more of those. Secondly, interest deductibility by removing it, has led to an increase in the percentage of first home buyers. We're up around 28% now. I think it was about 21% as National went out of office the last time. So I believe that it's a fair policy, but even if you don't want to take all of those reasons, just take the numbers. On average, a landlord is going to benefit by $6,000 a year from National putting that back on, and yet they want to pay for that in part by children who live in the poorest households in New Zealand being $2,000 a year worse off by the end of the forecast period. So by all means, campaign on tax cuts for landlords and millionaires, but how dare you pay for that off the back of the poorest children in New Zealand?
How dare you lecture me on thousands of dollars when on your watch house prices in a single year went up 30%, while on your watch rents have gone up on average
about fairness, Nicola, and how is it
well,
fair
I don't
for
think
landlords
it's
to
fair
get
that under your
$6,000
policies,
and the
tenants
poorest
are paying,
kids in New Zealand to lose $2,000? How's that fair?
I don't think it's fair that under your policies, tenants are paying more rent, that houses have become less affordable, that people's mortgages have become more expensive. You were the opposition spokesperson who promised to solve the housing crisis, and your government has made it worse.
And guess what? We've built more state houses than any government since the 1950s. If you had been building state houses at the rate that we have, we would have got rid of most of the state house waiting list. We've seen more building consents built. We've seen more building consents put out. This is a government that has addressed a long-standing issue in the housing crisis, and I don't understand why bringing foreign buyers back into the market that will inflate the house prices for everybody is somehow or other a solution to the housing crisis. It'll make it worse.
The effect of your policies...
Okay.
That's enough. Andrea, this is important because actually at the end of the day, there are four times as many people on the State House waiting list, and last night thousands of children had to go to sleep in a motel room because your housing...
Nicola.
They were in cars when you were there, Nicola.
Nicola, you've promised tax relief at this election, a mixture of changing the tax thresholds, childcare and working for families subsidies. Why did you make it so complicated?
Because we really wanted to target support at the squeezed middle and those with young families, because we know that the cost of living crisis has affected them the most. Often they are the ones who don't qualify for government entitlements like the accommodation supplement and subsidies, and yet they are working extremely hard and struggling to keep up. When you're a young family with massive childcare costs, massive housing costs, it's hard to keep going, and we want to send them a message that their work is valued, that we back them, we're going to let them keep more of what they earn, and they're going to be able to get ahead under a national government.
Grant, would you like to respond?
I come back to what I said at the beginning. The price of what Nicola is putting up is huge. It will mean getting rid of early childhood education extending out for 2-year-olds. It'll mean removing free prescriptions for many New Zealanders. It'll mean removing free public transport for kids under 13 and half price for those up to 24. We think targeted cost of living measures, adding into that the fresh fruit and veggies GST off, the dental care for under 30s, that gives you a package of things that will ease cost of living pressures. But in the end, it's irrelevant because Nicola's tax policy is a sandcastle. It's got monopoly money in it. It doesn't add up. It won't happen. And so her tax policy is actually irrelevant to the cost of living for New Zealanders.
Okay. So, Grant, tax thresholds have not been adjusted since Bill English did so in 2010, meaning that lower income earners are bearing more of the tax burden, but the Crown is taking in much more in tax. As a Labour Minister of Finance, why are you comfortable with this?
Obviously, every Minister of Finance would love to be in a position to be able to say to people, we want you to pay less tax. But as we've just been talking about tonight, this is a country that has faced a global pandemic, massive pressures on our public services, many of them needing to be rebuilt after 9 years of neglect from National. All of those things mean we have to make choices and prioritise. I would love to get to that point, but I think most people would agree right now putting up a tax cut policy when we're in the middle of this situation is exactly the wrong thing to do. It will be inflationary, particularly the way that Nicola plans to fund it. So at some point in the future, I would love to be in a position to do that. But if we want to talk about being a responsible finance minister, the responsible thing to do right now is invest in our public services and support New Zealanders through this difficult time.
This is actually a country that's faced a Labour government with a fundamental inability to deliver impact for the money that it spends. Why is it, despite spending being up 80%, people are waiting longer than ever in the emergency room at Wellington Hospital? Why is it that achievement in our schools has declined? Why is it that people are waiting longer to see the doctor? It's because it's not just about how much money you spend. It's about the results that you get for the spending, and you have failed to drive performance, you have failed to drive accountability, and New Zealanders know it.
I just love the way you edit out a global pandemic. So you edit out a global pandemic where we put billions of dollars into a health system to keep New Zealanders alive and healthy, and that's what we did.
And then what you did when we needed nurses desperately was you refused to put them on the green list for immigration purposes, and you let them all go to Australia and Canada instead, and our hospitals are still paying the price for that today.
You know that. You know that's not correct.
It is correct.
But equally, the money that we have spent has been on making sure we pay nurses properly. We've actually got nurses now on the top step over $100,000. That makes them competitive with other countries, whereas when National was last in government, nurse pay, teacher pay, it languished. We're investing in public services, investing in our health system.
Nicola Willis, after stints becoming opposition finance spokesperson, you've you bagged Labor for being high taxing, and yet you're going to fund your tax relief, at least in part, by a couple of new taxes on foreigners. And yet at the same time, National Party is very keen for New Zealand to become a place to work, play, save and invest. Can you explain the rationale between those two things?
Yeah, look, actually a large part of what we want to do in overturning the foreign buyer ban is say to the world, actually New Zealand is a place that's going places, and we want you to invest in our firms, invest in our future, invest in our industries and in high-paying jobs. And the way to encourage people to do that is not to say, actually, you're not even allowed here. We're one of the most xenophobic countries in the world that won't even let you buy a house. It's actually to say, yes, you can, but you need to pay a high price for it in recognition of the privilege that it is. And at the same time, we are also saying we should have normal practice, which is that around the world, immigrants pay the costs of their own visa processing.
So, Nicola, is it? I want to clear something up. Does this apply to people who do not hold a resident class visa in New Zealand, or is it their tax residency?
This applies to people who today are banned from buying a home.
No.
Under our policy,
I'm reading off
we will require them to pay a 15% tax. Grant, you've asked me a question and I'm going to answer, and I suggest you listen.
Please answer it.
Our policy is to capture those people who today are banned from buying a home. If they are prepared to spend more than $2 million on it and pay a 15% charge, then we want to let them do so.
But you haven't answered the question with respect, Nicola. Residence class visa or tax residence, which is it?
Our intention is to capture as many of those people as possible.
So the reason, Andrea, the reason Nicola's not answering this question is because there've been two different answers from National. One of them does say that it's about tax status, and I do think that seems to be National's position. And that raises a really serious issue about our double tax agreement with China. And I want to know whether Nicola can give a cast iron guarantee that Chinese buyers will be captured by this, because if they're not, there ain't no way it adds up. Nicola.
Last chance, Nicola. Do you want to respond?
Yes, Chinese buyers will be captured, Grant, and thank you for acknowledging that we're going to win the election.
I think we're a long way from that, Nicola.
So, Grant, you've had something of a road to Damascus on taking GST off fruit and frozen vegetables. Why did you change your mind?
For two reasons. The first of those was that I felt when this was being looked at some time ago that there wouldn't be a way that we could ensure compliance. We now have the Grocery Commissioner and the team that he will have at the Commerce Commission.
So what's he going to do?
Well, their job is to be able to look closely at what supermarkets do. They can request information. They can compel that from the supermarket. So they can collect that information, obviously at an aggregate level, supermarket by supermarket, and then they can go through and make sure that those benefits are being passed on. So that's the first reason. The second reason is that by making it apply to both frozen and fresh fruit and vegetables, we are meeting a need. The thing that gets raised with me the most often when it comes to the cost of living is about the price of food. And this is something practical we can do. There's actually an article in today's press about somebody who said, I've moved from fresh vegetables to frozen vegetables. Well, the good news is GST's off both of those if we're in government.
Nicola, do you want to start?
See, Grant's made this argument about the Grocery Commissioner a few times. The problem is, Labor announced the Grocery Commissioner in July 2022. And it was in March this year that you said that you did not support taking GST off fruit and vegetables because supermarkets would get most of the benefit. Actually, Grant, just be honest. You're among friends. What actually happened was you got rolled by the Prime Minister.
Well, if we're talking, Nicola, if we're talking about people getting rolled on their policies, should we talk medium density housing rules? Should we talk about those?
Hey, look, if you want to play tit for tat, how was that 7 months working on the wealth tax? Because that didn't end well for you, did it?
Well, I don't know. Were you in Bill English's office when they spent 6 months working on taxes on housing as well that didn't come through?
So here's the problem also with the GST policy. This is an important point. He had a long answer. For the Grocery Commissioner to do this fairy tale magic wand waving that you're asking this room to believe in, he is going to need an army of people with clipboards running around the dairies and grocery stores in New Zealand, and you have not put a single dollar for that in your fiscal plan. Not a single dollar, because you know that's fantasy, and you know that that can't happen, and you know that this policy will not be passed on to consumers in full.
Okay, we're out of time. We're out of time for this section that concludes the first half of our debate. So now please join Stuff's Chief Political Correspondent, Tova O'Brien, and her expert panel for some midpoint analysis.
Kia ora, everyone.
Koto katoa. I mean, hell's bells. Anyone would think there was an election 5 days away. I thought, you know, behaving themselves to an extent, but also some good moments of feistiness, as you'd come to expect at this point. I'd like to welcome very warmly our panel this evening to pick apart and examine what we've heard from the two wannabe finance ministers today. Former Labor leader, a man who went up against Grant Robertson for the leadership, in fact, David Cunliffe. So I'm not sure where your bias lies. Welcome. Round of applause for David, please. And Liz Mellish, chair of Te Raukura, Te Wharewaka o Pōneke, also chair of many, many other things, and as Tracy said as well, Wellington icon. Welcome.
Thank you.
And Cameron Bagri, welcome. Economist, we all know him well, and I think everyone in this audience in particular would know him well. Welcome. Can I start with you, David? Who's winning in this kind of tearing down, this war of tearing down of each other's fiscals?
Look, I think it's a high standard of debate, but the problem is that neither side comes out looking particularly good, and I don't know that the public is actually buying the package from either side. On National's side, their numbers have been pretty roundly criticised. It looks like they're about $600 million a year off in their costings. On Labor's side, they've basically gutted out of their policy package most of the meaningful tax policies, and Grant Robertson's doing a very loyal job of selling what could best be described as his second choice policy.
Very much so, and I think there that tit for tat at the end was so telling, and actually the only time, wasn't it, that Grant Robertson talked about the GST off policy was when prompted by Andrea and Luke. Do you think that Labor, and no mention of free dental either, do you think, Liz, that perhaps Labor is losing when it comes to the hearts and wallets on its major fiscal promises this election?
I suspect that's probably the truth, Tova. I think with both of them, they're worthy candidates, of course, and really understand the financial discussion. And what concerns me is I'm not hearing things that are for anything. Rather, it's more about that tit-for-tat arguing. And I particularly want to vote for something. And I want to hear that in the discussion.
And I mean, this is it. This is the tearing down into that, the puncture wounds, I think, in National's fiscal plan. Cameron, do you think that they are fair, and do you think that they are working?
So if you look at the tax plan is feasible. It's possible.
It's a glowing endorsement, isn't it?
It should not be confused with whether it's probable. Yeah, so if you look at the basic numbers, to raise 700 million, you've got to sell 1,700 houses to foreign buyers. According to REI and Z, there's about, typically in an average year, about 3,500, 2 million plus properties sold in a year. So about 50% need to go to foreigners. Yeah, so you can put, I guess, a bit of a reasonableness check in regard to whether that stacks up. And then I guess if we look at the other side, Grant has got a track record of spending more every year. So I look at both sides of the political fence in regard to fiscal plans, and as an economist, there's not a lot of confidence in either side.
Great.
Just to cheer you up.
Well, and to pick up on Liz's point as well about a vision or voting for something, sorry to bring it up if it smarts, but you tried and failed to campaign on a capital gains tax when you were Labor leader. Grant Robertson had been working on this tax switch, on the wealth tax. Had Labor campaigned on the courage of its convictions, do you think we'd be seeing a different set of circumstances now?
Undoubtedly, yes. Labor bled probably 4 to 5% of votes to its left after gutting its tax plan. And I think the polling was around swinging centre voters, which are always the prize, but they're not the only voters out there. I think it's left a lot of thinking voters wondering who the heck is actually going to drive transformation, because National is suggesting tax cuts which could be inflationary. We'll talk about machinery of government later. Labor's advantages, it did well on COVID, and it seems to touch the hearts and minds in terms of services, health, education and welfare that people care about. What's at risk is their record of delivering actual benefits.
Which is a very good point. And how much do you think Labor's kind of litany of FTDs on failures to deliver on some of its kind of core policies have impacted on perhaps what we're willing to buy from the Finance Minister this time round?
I think it's a bigger question than that, actually, Tova, and I want to go back to, I'm unashamedly sitting here as a Māori and looking at my own whānau and how are they going to sort this out, and what effect is it going to be for them. And there are things that we haven't quite hit the mark for, and let's talk about COVID, because as much as we all try to ignore it, the impact of that is immense. Absolutely immense. And we cannot pretend that it only happened in New Zealand. It is across the world. And for our people, one of the things that it highlighted was the inability to understand how to roll out a vaccination. And it required understanding of what was needed. Now, interesting, one of the things that has come up is the issue of the $5 on prescriptions, each part of a prescription. Now, that's something you can be for. We're not hearing enough about that. And as you get older, and I've got quite a few grey hairs now, you suddenly have to start having prescriptions every month, and you realise actually what it costs. I'll give you a shining example in Taranaki. The DHB determined that the rollout would be through chemists. And guess what? Our people wouldn't go in there because they couldn't pay the bill for the medicine. And that's, you know, these are the things that kill people. This is serious stuff. I want to hear more about how those social things, it did change, and it changed because one person I know very well rang up the head of the DHB and said, have I got a plan for you? And by the next day she had it rolled out and the whole thing changed. Those are the things that have impacted families for many years.
What's preventing them from doing these things? What's preventing them from doing these things, Cameron? Is it the money hose that Grant Robertson uses COVID as an excuse for? I think I'm very loosely paraphrasing Nicola Willis there. Is it what's preventing them from doing the things that Liz is calling for this election?
Well, you don't have a bottomless pit of cash. Now, conceptually, we'd like to do much more, but we get caught within what's called the impossible trinity. And this is where politicians want to provide cost of living support. You want to go from deficit to surplus. You don't want to add more pressure to inflation because the Reserve Bank's going to put up interest rates, and we don't want to pile on a lot more debt. At the same time, we want to increase the delivery of services. And I use the word delivery there intentionally because spending more money does not necessarily result in delivery on the other side. And what we're doing is that we're ping-ponging around from sort of quadrant to quadrant, trying to make the numbers sort of stack up. And it's really difficult. And what every finance minister, I think, faces reality, it's about balance. Where you try to make that, that situation palatable for most of society. But it's hard. It is very difficult.
Can I end on a slightly reductive note, just a whip around from the group? A few words just to describe the performance of each of the respective finance spokespeople. So starting with you, David, a few words for Grant Robertson and then for Nicola Willis, please.
I thought Grant showed tremendous experience. He had numbers at his fingertips and he had that trademark sense of humour. I thought he did very well. I thought Nicola Willis also performed well for somebody who's relatively new to the game. The issue for National is their numbers don't look like they quite add up. And for Labor, it doesn't look like the policy package, at least on tax and finance, is big enough to be compelling. And that leaves New Zealanders going, where's the there? Who do I vote for? And that's why we'll see the combined National and Labor vote at the lowest it's been for many years.
That's a very fine point. Liz, a few words for each of the finance spokespeople.
Look, I think, that they know each other very well. Here's the other thing. They've lived and operated around Parliament for many years, so they manage themselves particularly well, I think, in the debate. But actually, none of it's grabbing me and saying, yay,
Who's with Liz on that, just out of curiosity? Because we're hearing that a lot over the course of this campaign. We've got some undecideds perhaps in the audience. Cam, how would you describe the performance of the respective spokespeople?
Well, if I have a look at stepping back from performance, globally and locally, populism is now dominating in politics, and it's short-termism as opposed to the long game. And this is what you're talking about. I've not seen either step up and give us a 10-year vision as to where New Zealand is going, both economically and on the social ledger.
I think we've provided some very good guidance for both Grant Robertson and Nicola Willis going into this next period as well. We want to see this next segment. We want to see a bit more vision. We want to see a bit more inspiration. We want something to vote for from both of the finance spokespeople. So thank you very much, Cameron Bagri, Liz Mellish, and David Cunliffe. We'll be back again after this segment. Thank you.
half yours.
Oh, okay. All right, welcome back to our second half, and thank you to Tova and her fabulous expert panel. Now, just a quick reminder before we get into this and I introduce the candidates back on stage, please text in your questions. I had a little look backstage at some of the questions, and they are fantastic, so we're looking forward to getting into those. So now, please welcome back to the stage from the National Party, Nicola Willis. And from the Labour Party, Grant Robertson. Right now, this is Wellington, so this is a subject dear to all our hearts. We're going to focus on government services.
So, Grant Robertson, since the pandemic, government spending has ramped up as your government has increased investment in many areas. Yet, it has ramped up, but then since the pandemic, you've spent more again over on top of the budget. Why is that?
Because there's a huge need in New Zealand to deliver the public services that all of us want, and I think New Zealanders deserve. You know, an extra nearly 3,000 teachers during that period of time, an extra 4,000 nurses, an extra 1,600 doctors, 510 social workers. I could go on. This is the stuff that government is here to do, to create the environment in which everybody can achieve their potential, in which we address inequality. And so those investments are ones that are important in the here and now and important for the future. We have to get a balance right, and that balance comes by us progressively reducing our level of spending as a government back down to around 31% of GDP. But if I were to click my fingers and do that straight away, that would be austerity. That would mean that significant numbers of people would lose their jobs, but significant services would also disappear as well. So we have to strike a balance here. We invested heavily during COVID because it was the right thing to do. We have to keep investing in strong public services to give us the society that we want, and we're balancing that carefully by bringing that spending down over time.
Nicola Willis, is that right?
I don't know who you've been talking to, but there aren't many New Zealanders who say the society we have today is the society they want. Actually, you have failed to deliver the improvements in public services that you promised. Actually, there are tens of thousands more children growing up in benefit-dependent households. Achievement in our schools has fallen. Delivery in our health services has fallen. You baked in too much spending into projects of restructuring and centralisation at a time when New Zealand couldn't afford it. And the admission of that is that the first thing Hipkins did when he became PM was to do a bonfire of your precious policies. And then the second thing that happened was you were forced to admit you'd baked in too much spending and you had to go on a program of finding $2 billion worth of cuts. This is a feast and famine approach.
No.
You spent too much and now people are having to pay for it. And if you can't admit it, you should talk to the Prime Minister about it, because he certainly has.
Well, what the Prime Minister and I did was do what we did in every single budget, which is go looking for the savings and efficiencies that we can find. And yeah, we've found them, and we've said to the public service, we also want to find another 1 or 2% across different agencies. What National is proposing is a minimum of 6.5% cuts into those agencies. So, for example, you could cut all of the policy people, all of the comms people, all the comms and the advertising from the Ministry of Justice, and you'd still be 35 million short on what you claim you're going to save. You could do the same exercise at the Department of Conservation and you'd be $40 million short. You could do it at MSD and you'd be $55 million short. That means significant cuts to the public services that New Zealanders rely on, and that is the reality of National's policy. Deep, long cuts to the public services that New Zealanders need and deserve. It's certainly the record you had in the past, and you've baked it in to your fiscal plan.
Can I just pick up on this briefly? Nicola Willis, you've said consistently that government spending, which is currently $128 billion core crown spending this year, is out of control. Yet in your fiscal plan, you don't cut spending. You're not proposing to cut spending. You're proposing to reduce spending by about $3.3 billion more than Labor over 4 years. If spending's so out of control, are you guys walking the talk?
Thank you very much for introducing some facts to this debate, because actually what we are doing is walking a very measured course, because we want to have New Zealanders' backs during this very difficult time. And for us, that means getting on top of inflation and interest rates, reducing the tax they pay, and preserving and improving the frontline services upon which they depend. And we have been realistic in our fiscal plan that in order to deliver those services, we are going to need a lot of money unallocated that we can put towards cost pressures, and we've left that 10 billion unallocated. We're going to have to put a huge amount of funding into our health system. We've allowed for more than 14 billion to go into our health system. We're going to have to allow for this. Not just spending more, but delivering better results. And that's why we will set better public service targets, one of the first things Labor got rid of. That's why we will tie performance in government departments to the chief executive pay. That's why we will focus on social investment to ensure that we're getting better dividends from the money that we spend.
It's all about a dividend and social policy, isn't it, Nicola?
We're able to do that.
Fiscal dividend from social policy.
We are able to do that, Luke, while also taxing less, driving less debt, and spending in a more disciplined way.
It's great to introduce some facts into the debate. National's fiscal policy and its so-called buffer, so they reckon they've got about $1 billion buffer in next year's budget. $537 million of that so-called buffer comes from the foreign buyer tax that nobody thinks adds up. And in fact, the whole fiscal commitment is a sandcastle built on the heroic assumptions of the tax policy. And I do remember at the beginning of our happy roadshow we've been doing around New Zealand together that you said that the fiscal plan and the tax plan were not linked to each other. Actually, they are. You're propping the whole fiscal plan up on the sandcastle of $500 million of foreign buyer money that no reputable economists actually think adds up. So that will mean more cuts to services, Nicola. That's the only way you can pay for it.
Actually, you've got away with that line for too long, because the economic entity that you asked to review your fiscal plan, Infometrics, its principal economist, has said that the costings for the foreign buyers tax are plausible. So don't give me that it's not possible. And actually this,
respect to Brad, we can have a face-off between him and Michael Riddell later about who's right about your foreign buyer tax. But $500 million relies on the tax plan that doesn't add up.
The answer that he's looking for.
Nicola, do you want to finish, please?
Yes, I want to finish by saying this. Of course our fiscal plan has significant buffers built into it. Actually, in its first year, much more significant buffers
because
than yours.
You've got $500
Not
million
only
from
that,
the
but we have
tax
costed it conservatively. We have costed less revenue from the deduction of commercial depreciation than you have. We've taken conservative costings on our family boost policy. We've taken conservative costings on many of the measures in our plan. And that's why the independent experts who assessed it said that it is credible and consistent.
It is not.
And you are on no place to stand. You are someone whose every commitment in a fiscal plan of an operating allowance, every single one you've ever set and put in writing, you have broken.
Fair enough, Nicola. I presume when you're in government and a cyclone happens, you'll just ignore it and you'll say to the people where the cyclone said, "I'm really sorry, we set an allowance in December. We're not going to update it." We live in the real world, Nicola, and the allowances that we have provided have delivered to New Zealanders unemployment below where it was forecast to be at the budget policy statement. Debt below where it was supposed to be at the budget policy statement.
Moving on. It's getting a little bit Punch and Judy, so we're going to move on. Grant, to you first and then to Nicola. Universal, or in practice, rationed healthcare. Does the New Zealand economy produce enough wealth to fund it now and into the future?
We have to. I mean, for me, making sure that our health services are properly funded, that they're delivered not based on a postcode, but they're delivered well to New Zealanders right around the country, we have to do it. There is a long way to come back from long-term underfunding, but I believe we've made a significant start in doing that. But we have to make sure we deliver to New Zealanders. And I caught the end of some of the commentary. If you want a vision for a society, it's got to be one when we actually say the basic building blocks of health and education and housing are properly funded. We have been doing that after 9 years of it not being done, and now we're looking at a fiscal plan from National that will take us right back there. It will not be perfect. I get that. We're changing the entire health system from where it was to where it needs to be. We're in the middle of that journey now, but it's a journey that needed to happen. And we were the ones who took it on and said 20 DHBs is too many. We're going to make sure we have Health New Zealand and a Māori health authority, which National want to get rid of. I'm proud of the change. There's more work to do.
Okay, next. Nicola, universal healthcare, do we have enough wealth in the economy to fund it now and into the future?
Well, we think one of the most important duties of a government is to provide good health services to its citizens. And we're going to have to do two things to achieve that. First of all, we are going to have to put more funding in the future, and that's why our fiscal plan allocates more than $14 billion towards that goal and itemises targeted areas of spending that are going to be critically important. Getting more doctors and nurses, ensuring we've got money there for mental health, ensuring that we're funding good cancer treatments. But the second thing that we have to do, and Grant always loses sight of this, is only if we are a wealthier economy that is producing more and making more and creating more value in the world will we have the wealth needed for a first-class health system. You have to grow the pie as well as spending it.
Okay, all right. Grant, you're cutting public service baselines by about 2%, but only in backroom services. So please tell us, what is a backroom job and what is a frontline job?
Yeah, and you'll realise that as the Minister of Finance who announced that, we've actually been going through that process now with agencies. And ultimately, agencies and ministers will be the ones who have the final definition of that. It's pretty clear for people in the street to know that in our education system, it's our schools, it's our special ed teachers, it's the teacher aides, it's the people who are there. But also, we can see in other departments where things you might traditionally have thought of as backroom, maybe being the frontline comms person for somebody, is actually a frontline job, the person they ring when they've got an issue or a health problem. So those definitions have to take place within the agencies and for the ministers. But this is really important. We said 1 to 2% because it's credible. We think we can get there by reducing consultancy expenditure back down to where we had it before we hit COVID and to finding those efficiencies in those programs. What I know for certain is that if you try and find 6.5% among some of those agencies, as National want to do, that will be deep job cuts. And it has to be, and Nicola's admitted that about 6,000 people supposedly will lose their job before Christmas. Well, it's either that or it's David Seymour's 14,000.
Well,
you can choose.
Okay. That you are being slippery. Because you know that we are measuring two different things. Actually, what you've done is an overall baseline reduction, which is all of the money that government departments spend. What we've done is we've specifically excluded Te Whatu Ora, the Ministry of Health, the Ministry of Education and other frontline agencies, and we've said, look, any saving they can make in the bureaucracy, they should drive that money to the front line because boy oh boy do our schools and hospitals need it. And then what we've said is we've looked at just the departmental spending. So that is just the money that departments spend on running themselves, which since 2018 has gone up $3.5 billion across the agencies we've identified. That's a 62% increase, and we've said we think it's reasonable in a time when just about every household and small business in the country is having to rein in costs and go line by line through their spending, to expect government departments to do the same thing and find 6.5% of savings. And I tell you what, I've spoken to a lot of public servants in Wellington and they want to create more value. They want to drive more performance. They are up for the task.
On that, Nicola Willis, the National Party, if I may.
Give us a go here, Luke. Can we come back to what I said at the start of this segment? So you've got rid of, at DOC, you get rid of all the policy people, all the comm staff, all that. No, hang on, let me finish.
This is more
let
of
me
your
finish,
fairy
Nicola.
tale fantasy. It's
Nicola,
not happening.
let me finish.
Have a real argument about the real issues. Don't make them up.
I let you go before. If you did, you can choose to do it another way, but if you did all of those things, you'd still be $40 million short at DOC. So that means the work that they do in a regional setting and our conservation areas right around New Zealand, you'd have to cut. The same with justice. You do all of that, you're still 35 million short. That'll be more delays in the court system. MSD, that'll be people not getting the support that they should get. This is fantasy land if Nicola thinks it won't mean deeper cuts.
So moving along.
Okay. We are getting short on time, so a final question on this theme. The Ministry of Pacific Peoples made headlines for spending $40,000 on a leaving party for its chief executive. The Public Service Commissioner investigated this and said the CEO, the ex-CEO, should pay back the money. He took 9 months to do so. What are you going to do, Nicola Willis, to increase accountability in the public service?
Well, first of all, we're going to tie the pay of chief executives to the performance of their agencies. These are well-remunerated people and they should be held accountable for what they deliver. Second, we're going to set better public service targets so that we can track which agencies are actually delivering for New Zealanders and which are producing more reports and papers than they are outcomes and impact. And finally, what we're going to do is create a culture of spending restraint. Because the real problem about the Ministry for Pacific Peoples is that a culture had developed across government that allowed something like that to happen. And that's on your watch, Minister.
So, as we noted at the time, clearly that level of expenditure on that event was inappropriate. It was investigated, and as you noted, Andrea, the money was paid back. But let's just pause for a moment here. The Ministry for Pacific Peoples is a ministry that when we came into government was not able to deliver the services to its community. We've invested heavily in it so that it's now helping Pacific families into housing. It's helping young Pacific people to get the training and the skills that they need. It's developing financial literacy across a whole range of different organisations. It's supporting people at the grassroots level. None of that was possible. So I back the Ministry of Pacific Peoples, as I do a number of other ministries that David Seymour would like to see Nicola get rid of. And when the starting point of their policy is a 6.5% cut, I reckon David Seymour's probably going to get his way in that regard.
Okay, but to be fair, you didn't actually answer the question. What are you going to do to increase accountability in public service?
It's interesting that Nicola says we should tie chief executive pay. Most of the chief executives have a portion of their pay that is already tied to performance. And so, yeah, sure, that is definitely part of it. What we need is a culture of public service. And again, I can say coming in as a minister at the end of 2017, I was shocked by the fact that National had put these public servants in a position such as in areas like housing, where they thought it was their job to sell houses, not their job to build houses. So yeah, by all means, a culture of public service.
Okay,
Grant, how many houses has Kaingaora sold on your watch?
We're going to move on.
Significantly. We've added 13,000 net. We've added 13,000 net.
No, Nicola, we're going to move on to our final theme, which is future prosperity.
So I'd like to pose this question to you both, and I'll go to Grant Robertson first. When it comes to infrastructure, is New Zealand thrifty or cheap?
In the past, it's been both of those things. But what we need to do now is invest and invest heavily. We've got $77 billion of investment planned for infrastructure over the next 5 years. And in many cases, in many areas, that gets us back to where we should have been. So we have to invest far more. But it's also about making better use of the infrastructure that we've got and having better partnerships. You know, there is a massive resource base out there among post-settlement iwi who want to partner in building some of these projects. We're already doing it in some areas with the private sector as well. We need to do it with local government. We set the Infrastructure Commission up to give us a strategy. They've given us that. To give us an action plan. They've given us that. And now we have to resource it. The problem with parties of the right is that they think that PPPs are the solution to everything. And Nicola and I have been talking about the exciting day we had when we cut the ribbon on Transmission Gully. And I was pleased to be there because we'd finally managed to open it, even though it was $400 million over budget from what National said it would be. So there's a place for PPPs, but the big challenge for National is the core spending that central government has to do to make sure infrastructure delivers.
Nicola? New Zealand, big infrastructure is a big driver of economic growth. Thrifty or cheap?
We have a massive infrastructure deficit and we're going to have to deliver a lot more value. I noticed in Grant's answer that he talked about strategies and he talked about action plans. I'm surprised he didn't talk about business cases. But what he didn't talk about was delivery. This is the government that came in promising light rail to Mount Roskill by 2021 and not a metre of track has been laid. They have been ludicrously bad at actually getting infrastructure projects built. And there's three things that we need to do. Yes, we need to invest more as government, and our fiscal plan demonstrates that that is our commitment. But we also need to get much better at working with the private sector. Yes, iwi, but also the super fund, also the KiwiSaver funds, also, if they want to invest in it, the Canadian pension fund. And we need to get serious about cutting the red tape and regulation that makes it so slow and expensive to build things and make things in this country. We are going to be a building government that gets things done.
So yeah, just on the last of those, Nicola, the thing is that the concern you have about the time it takes to get things done relates to a thing called the Resource Management Act, which for 9 years your government did nothing to reform.
We tried and you blocked us. We've now
reformed it so that actually we will be able to do that. And fast-track consenting, which we've been doing, will carry on. And yeah, we do need partnerships with people. That offshore wind farm that's happening with Copenhagen Infrastructure Partners and the New Zealand Super Fund, that's an example of it. The problem is, under National, the record you have is that you don't play your part as central government in investing. That's the difference.
Grant, now forgive me, this is a long one, but on the eve of the 2017 election, you said the issue now is now's not the time for just simple management or drift. Now's the time for action. Now's the time for growing our productivity and ensuring that we've got good, high-paying jobs, which then also allow us to deliver on social services. So what 3 things have you done to grow productivity?
Well, productivity is, as you're noting, it needs at least 3 things. So if I do 4, you'll stop me, I'm sure. One of those is the investment we've made in skills. And in fact, when people ask me, what am I the most proud of as we went through COVID, one of those things is the fact that we made apprenticeships free. We put targeted trade training in. We've had 60,000 apprentices through. So skills are critical in making sure that we are a more productive country. The second is our investment in research, science and innovation. If you look at the countries around the world who we aspire to be, you look at the Nordic countries, you see the big difference between them and us is having been agricultural economies, they've added value on top of that. We do that through research, science investment. So the research and development tax credit was a start with that. We've done further investment now, and we're actually seeing ourselves getting above that OECD average, or getting towards it rather, for our investment in research and science and infrastructure. And the third thing is backing the people who are doing the new and exciting things. The game development sector, huge here in Wellington, 20% rebate came in this budget for that. So yes, we have got to address this challenge of productivity, and I said I'd do a 4th. I'm incredibly proud of the trade agreements that we've signed. We've had 7 new or upgraded trade agreements in the 6 years we've been in office. That opens the door to our exporters, covering nearly 75% of our exports now within those agreements. They're the building blocks of productivity. Wish we'd gone faster, had to deal with the pandemic, but the plan is there.
What specifically is stopping New Zealand firms being more productive, and what will you do about it?
Look, there's 3 areas that I worry about, that I know from talking to small businesses, medium businesses, people who want to start an enterprise in this country are getting in their way. One is the regulatory environment, where too many of our entrepreneurial people are spending hours at night at the kitchen table with the lamp on, responding to a new email from a government department or a new regulation, rather than thinking about how they can innovate on their farm and how they can create more value. And we need to be much more sensible about regulation, and that's why we've proposed a number of areas where we can make it better. But the second is infrastructure and delivering that better. But the final, and I think most important, is making sure that we are getting our people educated. And I'll quote Cam Bagri because he's here tonight. The best indicator of the future productivity of this country is what's happening in our classrooms today. And by that measure, we all need to be highly concerned, because our kids are slipping backwards in reading, in writing, in maths. And do you know where it's most pronounced? In our lower socioeconomic communities. And if we don't help those kids fulfil their potential and give them the basic skills they need to contribute to this economy, then our productivity will be out the window. So that's why we're going to change things in our schools. We're going to do the basics brilliantly. An hour of reading, writing and maths a day, structured literacy, assessment, progress reporting. That will make a difference.
Grant Robertson, the Labor Party, when it came to office in 2017, and again with impetus with COVID-19, had plans to reset the immigration system. Now, in the end, it appears you've been mugged by reality. It's going to be basically the highest level of migration on record in New Zealand. I mean, do you accept now that New Zealand's just a frontier economy that needs more people?
We've always accepted that immigration is going to play a part in New Zealand's prosperity. I think the way we train New Zealanders, the way we do make sure our school system works, and thank goodness we got rid of national standards, which actually were drawing down on the very things that Nicola was just talking about. Yeah, but all of those things are important along with immigration. What you're seeing now is a level of pent-up demand off the back of COVID. That's understandable. There was a lot of need. Treasury's forecasting that it'll come down to about net 40,000. That makes the building of infrastructure critical to make sure that that actually does end up being a positive for us. But we've put things within that system to make sure that it doesn't lead to a depressing of wages. So in fact, one of the things we've been criticised for by some people is in our industry agreements setting a wage that's well above the minimum wage to make sure it isn't part of a downward spiral for wages. It's a balance between making sure we train people who are here and bringing the workforce in that we need. We've had a big burst of it now. It will return to those lower levels.
Nicola Willis, is it a good thing that New Zealand be a high migration economy?
New Zealand is better off economically, socially and culturally thanks to the waves of New Zealanders who have come here from other parts of the world. We should welcome them, embrace them and thank them for choosing our country. And actually, if Grant was honest with you about the approach his administration has taken, they launched a grand experiment. They decided to see what happens if you say no to migrants. That's what they did after COVID-19. They kept that border tightly shut, and then they were very reluctant to let more migrants in. And what happened was, let me finish this, because actually if you talk to any business or employer in this country, they'll say they had pleading meetings with you, saying, please could you let us get some skilled workers in so we can get ourselves up and running again. We're desperately short on labour. You resisted, then you opened the floodgates, and now we have migrants being exploited living in squalor in South Auckland because you got the system wrong, because you said no for so long and then you allowed it to be turned on at full steam.
What a bizarre argument, Nicola. If we take it, I mean, it is unbelievable to me that throughout this campaign, when you and I have been having these conversations, I thought you were a person who respected and understood New Zealand's response to COVID, who actually thought that our job of looking after everybody was the right thing to do. And now, with hindsight, you're saying, oh no, you got all of that wrong. Well, I'll tell you what, I had to govern through that period, and they were some of the hardest decisions I have ever made in my life. And I back what we did at the border because it saved tens of thousands of lives.
Okay, Nicola, successive New Zealand government. Nicola, you've had your say.
To be clear, I'm not going to let that go unchecked. You know that I am not talking about the period when we were keeping people out to keep the disease out. I'm talking about the period afterwards when you maintained very restrictive immigration settings.
No,
so
what we did then was move
falsely
immediately
align
to
this
a
with
new
the COVID
immigration
response.
system, the one that you were just
That's
bagging.
actually quite cheap politics.
It's
and
not, Nicola. You're the one who made
better.
that comment.
Okay, Nicola, successive New Zealand governments have not made sufficient provision for that New Zealand growth and indeed for immigration. Not enough houses, motorways, trains or buses. So what's the National Party going to do differently?
We're going to invest in infrastructure. We're going to invite the private sector to help us increase that investment. We're going to go for growth. That means building transport connections that will allow for new areas of land to be opened up for housing. Here in Wellington, building a road from Granada to Petone, not only to get traffic off the Noronga Gorge, but to open up land for more than 5,000 homes. And at the same time, we're going to work much better with local government, because for too long, local government have been given the burden of trying to provide more housing and infrastructure, but haven't been able to work constructively alongside central government to do that. We're going to do city and regional deals. We're going to work with local government to help them fund the extra housing when it comes along. If they get above their historic averages, we'll ensure that they get some funding for that. We're going to give them new funding and financing tools so that they can get infrastructure built. We want want to be a building government and that builds for growth.
So, we absolutely do need to work closely in partnership with local government to address a lot of these issues. It was fantastic when Nicola came forward with Judith Collins and supported our medium density rules to make sure that cities like Wellington didn't just grow out, but actually grew up and were more efficient and were more environmentally friendly as well. Unfortunately, National backed away from that, but we are still committed to working with our local government to make those things happen. But there's an element of infrastructure which we haven't discussed tonight, and that's water. And the issue that we've got as a country is that for far too long, we have underinvested in what we've called the three waters. We came up with a plan that actually makes sure that we can start to address that by aggregating entities together. Now, I get it that some people didn't like elements of that plan, but when National brought their fiscal plan out the other day, zero. Nothing in it to actually make the changes that need to happen to keep our water safe, to keep our sewage where it's meant to be inside the pipes, and to make sure that our stormwater systems work. They have left local government completely adrift in this plan, and that will mean more inaction, more bad health outcomes, more bad water outcomes. We have a plan for it, we're partway through delivering it, and it is critical to New Zealand's infrastructure that it goes ahead.
This gives rise to a very big issue that we haven't really touched on yet, and of course that is the role of the Finance Minister, infrastructure and climate change. And climate change is going to be the single biggest cost on New Zealand business, families, communities and the government over the coming decades. Are our public finances structured, Nicola Willis, in such a way to handle the investment that is going to be required?
I think they are, but we are going to have to do a couple of things differently. The first is we're going to have to acknowledge that the way we will drive fossil fuels out of this economy is by putting a higher price on those fossil fuels. We need polluters to pay a price for polluting. That requires an emissions trading scheme that does its job. So we are going to have governments that face up to that and don't continue to intervene and end up in court as the current government has. We're also, I think, in order to sustain that and make sure that people stay with us on that decarbonisation journey, going to have to make sure that the extra revenue that is raised goes back to people in the form of a climate dividend that reduces the taxes they pay. But the second thing that I think is going to be critically important is the way that we invest in infrastructure. And I think in order to do that, we are going to have to get better at getting a lot more value out of the infrastructure investment that we do, working much more collaboratively in a much more long-term way alongside our local government partners. The current on-again, off-again approach will not get us there.
So on climate, I do think it is the biggest dynamic that the Minister of Finance currently faces. To answer your question specifically, Luke, Treasury's current advice means we're not factoring in the long-term costs to us because that's not how the Public Finance Act works. Myself and James Shaw have been working through with them because we will need to come up with a way within our public finance system. In the meantime, what we need is action on climate. That's why we created the Climate Emergency Response Fund, recycling all of that money of the ETS to go into emissions reduction and also now into adaptation. Every cent of that is gone under Nicola's plan, and she calls it a climate dividend. It's a little bit like George Bush and the Clean Air Act. It's not. She's taking all of the money and putting it into tax cuts. No money to support the decarbonisation of public transport, no money to support our big polluters to be able to reduce their emissions. So it's all very well to talk the talk, but actually walking the walk comes from funding it, and every cent of that fund is gone under National's plan.
And I'd ask you this. How do you justify low-income working people paying progressively more for their petrol, a cost they cannot avoid, while you write big cheques to multi-billion-dollar profitable polluters? It doesn't make sense.
Because that deal with NZ Steel takes 1% of our emissions out. If you don't want climate action, that's fine. But if you do, you've actually got to do your bit to make it happen. It wouldn't happen without government support.
OK, Grant Robertson, have New Zealand governments of both stripes failed to level with the New Zealand public about how much mitigating our emissions and adapting to climate change is going to cost?
No, I don't necessarily think we have, but I think the journey to get there needs to be backed by consistent policy. I do agree with that. And it is a balance. You do have to bring people with you, and having the carbon price go up is not costless. You know, under Nationals policy, you'd see petrol up by maybe 40 cents a litre. So those low-income families would really be struggling at that point to pay if you simply let the ETS go. So it's a managed process, it's a balanced process, and it's a partnership. We absolutely have to grab it. But I do want to say one thing before we finish this segment. Along with being an enormous challenge to us, climate change also represents economic opportunity for us, because New Zealand is the best in the world at renewable energy. We're the best in the world at sustainable agriculture. We need to take that, add value to what we do now and sell that to the rest of the world. And if we don't get it right, we're in huge trouble. I was in the UK last year. The supermarket buyers there were saying it's not about air miles anymore, it's about the whole life cycle of every product. If we can't tell those people exactly the carbon emissions, if we can't show them the way our farms are adapting and changing, we won't sell into the market. So it is a social issue, an environmental issue, but it is also an economic one for New Zealand.
Nicola, the final word to you, please.
I'd agree that there is some significant opportunity for New Zealand in this area. We have the capacity for abundant, affordable, renewable energy. And that is why we've set a goal of doubling the amount of investment in renewable generation so that we can have the abundant electricity that is needed to have a lower carbon country. We also need to be putting our people at the front of the line when it comes to breakthrough technology in the agriculture space. We can be the country in the world that helps solve the difficult problem of methane emissions. We have some of the smartest people in agri-tech. We have the history of wonderful breeding. We have the history of innovative farmers. But right now, we are tying their hands behind their backs by refusing to let them do the gene editing that will provide the breakthrough solutions that are needed. So we've got to say yes to science and no to the regulatory red tape that is stopping our farmers solving this problem.
Okay, all right. You've heard enough. You've heard enough from Luke and I tonight. It's your turn for questions, and we've got some really good ones. So I'm going to start tonight a question to both of you. Would you give up the finance portfolio to a coalition partner if you have to?
We won't have to do that.
No. What does David Seymour want?
How's it going to be with James Shaw, Marama, Rawiri,
It's been great with them for the last couple of years.
How's that going to be?
It's been great with them for the last couple of years.
Oh, tell New Zealand that. He thinks it's great because he reckons it's the backdoor way to get the wealth tax, you see?
I'd like to go to another question for the audience, and I think this is just a great big conceptual question. Is the tax system fair?
No, working people are being overtaxed.
And how big a chunk of the population is working people?
I think people who are paying through the PAYE system at the moment are getting unfairly treated because tax brackets have not been adjusted for inflation, nor have important credits like the independent earner credit been adjusted for wage inflation. Those adjustments should happen
So
regularly.
one of the things we did was make sure that we made the income tax system more fair by lifting the top rate to 39 cents. That lowering that back was the National Party's policy, and Chris Luxon said, might not be able to fit it in the first term, but if I got a second term, he'd want to do that. That would make our system more unfair. Also, an area where I think we definitely need to do a lot more is the way in which multinationals work in New Zealand. Unfortunately, we've got a lot of companies here, particularly digital ones, who get away with paying virtually no tax. We're working on that at the OECD, but we've said that if we cannot get that multilateral agreement, we, from the 1st of January 2025, will bring a digital services tax in so those people actually pay their fair share.
Okay, this is a very niche question, but there is a lot being said about working for families and a squeezed middle. What are you going to do for single people between 31 and 65? Nicola.
Great question, and I've knocked a lot of doors during this campaign where people of that age group without kids say to me, are we the forgotten people? And that's why when we designed our tax plan, we wanted to really target those median incomes. So under our tax plan, someone earning $60,000 a year with no dependents will get an extra $50 a fortnight. We targeted our tax plan at the squeeze middle, and you laugh. But I have knocked on the doors of people who are giving up meat, who are worried about whether or not they can go to see their parents in the weekend because they can't afford the train fare. And I know that $50 in this economy will make a big difference to a lot of people.
But the problem, Nicola, is it's a massive... The policy is a massive scam because it does not add up. There's no way that you can pay that. You're knocking on the door of those people and you're selling them a scam. Your tax policy does not add up. No reputable economist thinks it adds up.
You sold them Kiwi Build and promised them 100,000 houses.
I'll put our record on housing up against National's record on housing any day of the week. Because you know how many affordable homes got built under National? You don't, do you? It's about 100.
How many
we built
houses have you
1,700
built,
of
Grant?
those,
How
plus
many
had
have you
200,000.
They believed you, and now they don't.
No, what they know is that we have built more state houses than any government since the 1950s.
And you've got more
we
people
don't
on
tell
the State
people
House
to
waiting
sell
list
state
than ever.
houses like National did.
4 times as many people on the State House waiting list and thousands of people in emergency accommodation. Such are your failures on housing.
Robertson. A more prosaic question from Greg. Is inequality irrelevant in high inflation times?
No. Inequality, getting to a more equal society, is always relevant. And it's the reason why during a period of high inflation, we've made sure that we've lifted benefits, we've made sure that we've lifted the family tax credit, we've made sure that we've lifted the minimum wage consistently over a period of time. Addressing inequality has to be the bread and butter of government, whatever the economic times.
Inequality is something we should be addressing, and we do that by providing both equal opportunity, ensuring that fewer children are growing up in benefit-dependent homes, that more children have the opportunity for a good education, that more people move off welfare into work. But we also do that by making sure our economy is delivering. And when you look at the material hardship figures, under the last 4 years of the National Government, 56,000 people moved out of material hardship. In the past few years under Labor, only 21,000 have moved out. And the reason for that is this: inflation is terrible for people in poverty. And during the peak of the inflation crisis in 2022, instead of solving it, you poured billions of dollars of government spending onto the inflation crisis, and you paid for cost of living payments. But you paid for cost of living payments to French backpackers and rich lawyers in London.
Nicola, that completely defeats your argument, because you know that 98.2% of that cost of living payment went to people living in New Zealand. So the very people you just said before you were concerned about, you'd rather turn that into a political point about 1.8% of the people who got the payment.
I'd rather have given them a
The people
tax
who got the money were people who needed the money.
OK, we're going to make this the final question of the evening. To both of you, what's more important, health and well-being or GDP? Nicola?
Health and well-being, which is a product of more GDP. Grant?
Health and well-being, and one of the things that I'm incredibly proud of and that I want to keep going with is the introduction of well-being budgeting, because when I came in, all we got was reports on GDP. We didn't get reports on what the economy was delivering. The economy is a means to an end. It is not an end in itself. The end point is well-being, and the end point is making sure that New Zealanders can live the lives that they want to live. There's always more to do when it comes to well-being, but I'm incredibly proud to have prioritised it.
Well, folks, that brings our finance debate to a close. I want to say a big thank you to the very lively audience tonight, and a very huge thank you to our candidates, Labour's Grant Robertson and Nicola Willis. Nicola Willis from the National Party.